Gittin Pei Vav Amud Aleph, Handwriting and Signatures, Katav Bichtav Yado. We're still on that posuk in Ki Teitzei that we've been for the entire Masechta. Isn't it quite incredible? You've got a volume of the size of Masechta Gittin, with all the Meforshim that are written on that, volumes and volumes of Meforshim, all to explain one posuk in the Torah. And each part of the Masechta we've been dealing with a different aspect of that verse in the Torah. And here we're dealing with it where it says that when a man wants to divorce his wife, v'chatavla sefer kritut, he must write for her a sefer, a story of separation, v'natan biyada, and must give it into her hand. So the role of writing, what is this? What is the role of writing here? Does it mean that he must give her a document, that this has to be documented? Or does it mean that it must be done with the act of writing? Are we talking about the outcome of writing, which is a document? Or are we talking about the action of writing? And they're two different things. The Gemara says back on Daf Chaf Aleph, and we'll have it again in the beginning of Masechta Kiddushin, where the Gemara says, what does the word v'chatavla mean? And the Gemara says at the bottom of the first page of the source sheets, biktiva mitgareshet ve'ena mitgareshet bekesef. You might think that since a person gets married with a Kinyan kesef, he gives her a ring under the chuppah, maybe the way of getting divorced is to take the ring back, or to give something else, some kind of a Kinyan. No, we learn from the Torah that biktiva mitgareshet ve'ena mitgareshet bekesef. She is divorced with ktiva, with writing, and not with money. The wording of that Gemara seems to imply that it's the act of writing, biktiva mitgareshet velo bekesef, not the act of giving a ring, but the act of writing a ksuba and handing that ksuba over to her. So the action of writing seems to be important. It's significant just to notice, I don't think we'll have time to go into it, but when the Rambam references that Gemara in his opening to Hilchos Gerushin, in Perik Aleph, the Rambam says, Eina isha mitgareshet ela bichtav. He doesn't say biktiva, he says bichtav. And that's a difference. That means the Rambam is learning that v'katavla means she's got to have a document. The Gemara itself, the way we have understanding the Gemara without the Rambam, is biktiva mitgareshet. There's an action of writing. Writing is important, not just ktav. And the difference between writing and having something written is vast. We'll see about it in our discussion around Gittin. But even in our day-to-day life, it's important that when you write something down, you get a source sheet, and I mentioned yesterday how important that is. And somebody asked where you find the source sheet. So if you look on the podcast, if you look in the description, you'll see there's a link. It says sources. You click on the link, and it takes you to the PDF of the sources. On the app, there's a separate folder with all the sources in the folder. On the YouTube, I don't think that we have a link yet for that. The source sheets, you have it all written out in front of you. That's very different from when somebody is writing notes. Like Reb Sender, you write a lot, I notice, right? And Philip, you sometimes go home and write. The act of writing, even if you don't keep your notes, the act of writing does something to one's understanding of what's happening. You're bringing it down from something very abstract into something that you're articulating in writing. And that's why it's good to write down your thoughts. It's good to journal. It's good to make notes after you've had a meeting with somebody. Sometimes you don't make notes at the time because you want to be fully present when you're talking to somebody. You don't want to be distracted by notes, but then you write notes afterwards. And it's not even for filing away. It's not even to have the notes. It's to write the notes. V'chatavla biktiva mitgareshet. It's the act of writing that is important in this process of Gittin. It's important to write. And the latest research shows that it doesn't help typing. With typing, you have the notes. So according to the Rambam, that bichtav, you need a written document, you can write it on a computer. You've got a written document, you've got the source sheets. But the act of ktiva, that's when you write with a pen. And not only that, but they're discovering that cursive writing is more valid than printed writing. And we'll see that in our Gemara as well. And they're starting to teach children again in schools how to write in cursive. Because in cursive, you really express yourself. In cursive, there's fine motor coordination that is a form of body language. Just as when you express yourself with your body language, the way you walk, the way you stand, the way you speak. So when you write, that's a form of body language. When you print, it's not the same. It's too formal when you print. It's too structured. But cursive writing is freer. And that b'ktiva, that mitgareshet, that idea of ktiva, of writing something, is to allow yourself just to write in a cursive form, because it's so valid and so important. There's a lot of research that's being done now on what we're missing by not having handwriting and reinstituting handwriting into the school curriculum. Now our Mishnah says, so what happens if the man wrote a get and there are no witnesses on it? If it's a document that you need, if it's a k'tav, as the Rambam says, that in mitgareshet b'k'tav, you need a written document, then a written document means you've got witnesses. But if it's b'k'tiva, it's the act of writing. What happens if he writes a get himself in his own handwriting? He doesn't use a shaliach, he doesn't use an agent, meaning the sofer, the secretary of the Beis Din who writes. He doesn't tell him to write the get, he writes it himself in his own handwriting. Is that a valid get or isn't it? And our Mishnah says it is a valid get. Midoraisa, it's a valid get. It's a get pasul, meaning he should do it again. We don't like that kind of a get. But im niseit avlad kasher, but if he gave a woman a get with no edim on it, only with his own handwriting, the woman takes the get and gets remarried and has a child from the second husband, the child is not a manzah, says the Mishnah. The get works, even though there are no witnesses on it. So you see the power of handwriting. And Rashi says, what about Rabbi Meir? You remember, right at the beginning of the Masechta, we dealt with the Machlokas Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar, where Rabbi Meir says, Ede chatima karti, you need witnesses on the document. When it says v'chatavla, it means a valid document with witnesses. How does this Mishnah work according to Rabbi Meir? Says Rashi, his own handwriting is like 100 witnesses. And the understanding of that, there are different people who approach this differently, but as I understand the Rashi, that doesn't mean it's like Chodat Baldin Kamea Idim Dami. It's like when an individual himself admits to owing money or whatever, it's as if there are already 100 witnesses. That's not what Rashi's talking about. What Rashi's saying is the purpose of witnesses on a get are simply to tell us that the husband wrote it. Either he wrote it himself or he instructed the sofer of the Beis Din to write the get. That's what you need witnesses for. That it's v'chatav la, the witnesses say, we were there and we saw him instruct the sofer to write this get for this particular wife. We saw that. That's what the witnesses are for. But if it's in his own handwriting, you don't need witnesses. It is like 100 witnesses. That what? Not that there was a divorce. That's not the purpose of the witnesses in the get. The purposes of the witness in the get is to give evidence that he wrote it. But if it's in his handwriting, you don't need witnesses. You can see his handwriting. Because the Gemara knew already that handwriting is unique. And that's why we can do graphology, we can do handwriting analysis, because everybody's handwriting is unique. Everybody's handwriting is different. Not only is handwriting different, but your own handwriting differs depending on your mood and what's going on in your life. It's very immediate. Handwriting tells exactly where you're at as a person at that particular moment. And then Rashi adds, and if we don't learn it like Rabbi Meir, then kivan de katav yadohu v'chatav v'natan karina be. Since it's his handwriting, and it says in the Torah v'chatav v'natan, it doesn't say you must write a get and have edim on it. It says v'chatav la v'natan, he must write. This, since he wrote it, v'chatav v'natan karina ba, this is called, he wrote it. That's what the Torah says. Even if there are no Eidei Mesira, according to Rabbi Elazar, where you need Eidim when you hand it over, it's still Midoraisa, it's a good get, because he wrote it and he handed it over, and that's what the Torah says you have to do. It's about writing it. Rashi says in Yevomus, on Daf Lamed Amud Beis in Yevomus, he says, Alma K'tav Yado, he compares this to a monetary case. If a man writes a document and says an IOU, he says, I owe so-and-so, I owe X amount of money. That's obligated. You don't need Eidim for that. Says Rashi, the same applies here. And the Rabbeinu Karkash, it's actually historically very interesting, because the Ritvo attacks Rashi on this in a sense, although the Ritvo in Masechta Gittin supports Rashi on this. This is one of the proofs that the Ritvo on Masechta Gittin is not the Ritvo, it's Rabbeinu Krashkash. And recently, the Mosad Rav Kook produced the real Ritvo. So we've now got two Ritvos on Masechta Gittin. We've got the Ritvo, which has always been called the Ritvo, but is in fact the Rabbeinu Krashkash. And we've got the actual Ritvo. And here's a good proof that the Ritvo that we have is not really the Ritvo, because there's a contradiction between the Ritvo in Gittin and the Ritvo in Yevomus. Be that as it may, the Ritvo also says here, Rabbeinu Krashkash also says here, Delo shna ktiva belo chatimato, chatimato belo ktiva mahani bein bishtarot bein begittin. It makes no difference if you're talking about a mandatory shtar or you're talking about a get. We see that if somebody writes with his own handwriting, what is produced is obligating. Dakolu bichlal ktav yado. This is all called ktav yado. And as Rashi says in Yevamot, alma ktav yado b'lo edim miltahi. He's not comparing the two cases of a mandatory document and a get completely, because there is a difficult to compare, as the Ritvo says. But he is saying you do see from there that a person's handwriting is valid. It's something. It tells you something for sure. And in the case of Gittin, our Mishnah says it's enough, because it says v'chatavla, that's all that you need, and the handwriting is defining enough. And Ri says, back on Daf Gimel, Tosfos talks about this Gemara on Pei-Vav, he talks about it back on Daf Gimel in our Masechta, and he says, Ein lecha chatima gedola mizu. There is no better signature than a person's handwriting. What is a signature at the end of the day? You write your name in your own handwriting. Well, if you've written a whole paragraph in your own handwriting, that's even better. There's no better signature than your own handwriting, says Ri. And the Rabbi Zalman and the Even Hazel explains that because the role of the Eidim is you want to prove that this is the document that the husband wrote. That's all the Eidim do. And if it's in the husband's handwriting, you don't need Eidim, because clearly the husband wrote it. Who else could have written in his own handwriting? And that's why Incha Chatima Gedola Mizu. And all of this is built around the Gemara on Daf Chaf Aleph, that Bektiva Mitgareshet. What's important is that he writes it. Either he writes it himself, or he instructs an agent, a sofer, to write it, in which case you need Eidim. Why do you need Eidim? To make sure that we know that this was in fact an agent, this was in fact his intention. That's why you need Eidim. But if he writes it on his own, you don't. There's a beautiful run on the Rif, on the second page of the source sheets, where the run investigates whether when we say his own handwriting, does it have to be with his own signature as well? Does he have to write the get and sign it? Or is just writing it enough? And the run proves writing it is enough. Ktav yado ma'aseh shtar ka'avid mechayev atzmo nami b'chtav yado. Just writing with your own handwriting is a mechayev. If you write an IOU in your own handwriting, it's not that document is then proof that you owe the money. That document creates the debt. Normally, the debt is created when you borrow money. I borrow money from you, and there are witnesses who see, that creates the indebtedness. But if I didn't borrow money from you, I just write, I owe you $1,000. Then that is something you can act on. You can later on take me to Beis Din and claim the $100, the $1,000, even though you never lent me $1,000. Once I've said I owe you $1,000, that's a mechayev. That creates the obligation. So we see that handwriting creates. It's a creative force. It can create a hitchayvut in monetary matters, and it can create a get. The handwriting itself, it's not the eidim that create it. So we've got three different kinds of eidim. We've got eidim in monetary matters who are used for proof. In the event that there's a question, you've got two witnesses that can give evidence. We've got eidim in kiddushin. In marriage, at a marriage ceremony, you have eidim not for proof. The eidim actually are an essential part of the marriage surface. Without eidim, there is no kiddushin. The eidim are eidei kinyan. They create the act of kiddushin in the state of kiddushin. That's the second kind of eidim. And the eidim on a get are eidim, and there's a question whether this is linked to monetary documents or not, but it seems to be a third category of eidim. Here the eidim are simply to say that this get was created by the intention of the husband, and if the husband wrote the get himself, you don't need eidim for a get. That's the chiddush of this Mishnah. You don't need eidim for a get if the husband wrote it himself. And we see from here the power of handwriting, and it's interesting that the Ran goes into the difference. Do you need him to sign it as well? There's a difference between signature and handwriting, and we use those differences in graphology today. That where you sign something, you don't sign with a subconscious thought of this has to be legible. Somebody has to be able to read my signature. Because usually when you sign something, they ask you to write your name beneath it in any case. So the purpose of the signature is it's your mark, it's your stamp. But it doesn't have to be legible. But when you're writing a letter, or you're writing a document in your handwriting, you're actually thinking about its legibility. Somebody has to read this. Whether it's you yourself that want to read it later on or somebody else has to read it. So there's a difference between handwriting and signature. Signature is you, your most raw, spontaneous being, just as you are. You're not thinking about what it looks like so much, although when people design very elaborate signatures, they sometimes are thinking of their branding. What does my signature look like? But the average person signs, he's not signing about what it looks like, he just wants to get the signature done as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But when you write, you're actually expressing the way you engage with the world, the way the world experiences you. So in graphology, we use both. We use the signature and the handwriting, and we use the difference between the signature and the handwriting. And that's why the Ran goes into this deep analysis. When you write your own get, do you also have to sign it or not? And the Ran says, no, even though handwriting is something that you write with legibility in mind, and it's not just a spontaneous self-expression, you're actually forming the letters with intention. Nevertheless, every individual forms letters differently. Every individual has his own way of forming the letters, and therefore the handwriting is sufficient. Not so much as proof, because again, the purpose of the get is biktiva mitgareshet. It's not so much that she needs the proof, because afterwards she can destroy the get. It doesn't matter. And the get has to be written lishma. It's about the writing of the get. It's the act of writing that's important, and the act of giving it over to her. It's not the act of recording the divorce in writing. It's the act of writing, because when you write, whatever it is that you're writing takes on a completely different form. And it's a very good habit to get into when you're learning, when you've thought about something, to write it down. Because as you're writing it down, the clarity that comes, the new angles that come, the personal investment in the idea is much greater. And that's the idea that we have in our sugya here. Today's shiur was sponsored by an anonymous person, so we thank him very much for that. In learning about handwriting and signatures in the understanding of the Gemara of the Mishnah on Daf Pei Vav Amud Aleph.